with me.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Roxx with me. It's your girl, Roxy. And did you hear that badass, dope ass, finally have a podcast intro song? Well, I'm going to give a shout out and got to show off that there singing was the vocals of my little sister, Jewel Marie. Her, my brother, and my other sister. They're all musically talented. Me, I could just dance and break it down. I was the one that was always in sports. They were always the one in music. Like they could hear a tune, play it. Their voices are so beautiful. They get it from my dad. Me, I got it from my mom. Now, before I start this episode, I do want to remind you all, if you haven't heard it today, you're hearing it from me now. I am proud of you. You are remarkable and you're meant to be here. Now, this is the series where I'm going to be talking about books I've read, book reviews, all that shazam. I'm going to be calling it Book Talk with Roxx. From this series, this is the first episode and I'm doing a double header. I thought it'd only be right if I did so, seeing that we're in the month of October. October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which is something so close to my heart. I'm all for breaking the silence and standing up against domestic violence. So with that being said, I'm actually going to be covering two books that are part of a series and have become very popular over the last couple of years. So, especially on TikTok, which TikTok is how I found the first book. It is the series of It Ends With Us and It Starts With Us by Colleen Hoover. I decided why not do a review on this because there's a movie soon to be coming out with Blake Lively and all that good stuff. And when I first picked up this book, I thought it was going to be like a romance book, but it definitely isn't. It should have came with bigger trigger warnings because it definitely took me some pauses and some, step aways from the book to read the first one. The second book of the series, it wasn't so much, but I related and highlighted way more quotes from the second book than I did the first. Now, for those that don't know, this series narrated through the eyes of Lily Bloom. Lily Bloom is a girl who falls in love and as a teen, then loses contact with her teenage, sweetheart. Years pass, she finds someone, falls in love with them. And then to make matters kind of messy, like any dramatic novella, the love of her life from her teenage years comes back into her life coincidentally after she starts dating who she thinks she's meant to be with. That plot right there seems like just a typical love triangle novella type of dramatic, book that, yes, I need to know the deets. I need to know what's up. I need to know the drama. Give it to me. And that's what I went in thinking about. But honestly, there is talks of domestic violence in this book and it gets detailed, which is why I'm putting that trigger out there now. If you want to read this book, read it with caution because there are some chapters in this book that do go into details of domestic violence. Because as you read the book, you find out that Lily Bloom grew up in a household where her father was abusive towards her mother. And you find out later in this book, spoiler, the guy that she meets as an adult that she falls in love with, his name's Ryle, he ends up being abusive towards her. There's reviews out there that end up stating, this book is horrible because Colleen Hoover romanticizes domestic violence and how could she and blah, blah, blah. And honestly, me personally being a survivor myself, reading this book is literally raw to the point where it's one of those that literally describes the cycle someone stuck in an abusive relationship goes through. The cycle of he loves me, it was an accident, or it was my fault that he hit me. I shouldn't have laughed at him when I did. Like I embarrassed him. Like it goes back to being our fault. And that cycle where they end up apologizing, telling us how much they love us and telling us that it was an accident. They don't know what happened. It'll never happen again. To forgive them. You end up forgiving them, praying, hoping, wishing it's the last time. And they're good for a couple, days, maybe weeks if you're lucky, maybe months if you're even luckier. And then it all goes back to the beginning with another tantrum, as I called it during my I Am Resilient episode when I explained my personal story. And it's funny because during my story, when I was sharing my story, during the second episode that you can all listen to called I Am Resilient. I ended up going more into depth on emotional abuse that I went through and not necessarily the physical abuse. And I believe it's more because granted, none of the two are better, but the emotional abuse seems to take a lot longer to process and to heal than the physical abuse of it does. The physical abuse, there's bruises fade, and you no longer see them on your arms, legs, wherever. But the emotional abuse really sticks to you inside. It's wounds that aren't visible to the public eye. It's wounds that aren't visible to everybody around you. It's the heaviness of the words, the name calling, the degrading you, belittling you, making sure they manipulate you into knowing that you are worthless, making you believe you are worthless no matter what you do. It's a cycle. And there's also other types of abuses like financial abuse, where they control the money, how it's spent, making sure you don't have that financial freedom to be able to get away. There's a lot of types of abuse, a lot of different levels of abuse. And this book ends up just being so real about it, putting it on paper, the cycle of the abuse, how mindfuck type of game it really is. And I feel like those that have been through it will understand the story of this book more than those who are blessed enough to have never gone through that type of situation. That's why it just it breaks my heart that people are out there blaming Colleen Hoover for romanticizing an abusive relationship, because the main character, Lily Bloom, honestly is stuck in this cycle during the first book of forgiving him, getting back with him, making excuses for him in all senses. And I think those people that are criticizing Colleen Hoover and blaming her for romanticizing these abusive relationships, I could only assume they've been blessed to never have been in one themselves, where the cycles are harder to break. Easier said than done. I'm going to shout out that Netflix series Made. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you go see it, because that series in itself was very relatable. And that one took me some time to watch, because it was just so raw with it. And it showed the cycle of abuse, the cycle of having nowhere to go and having to go back. So this book does the same thing. And then it's crazy, because as I had read it, Lily Bloom, I felt such a connection to her because of the cycle she was going through. Turns out, if you read the note from the author, Colleen Hoover explains how mom was in an abusive relationship and the memories she has in the childhood home she grew up and such. And so she dealt with it as a witness of her mother's abuse. Luckily, she's never felt it herself, but she does make a point to state how she was proud of her mother before writing this book, but after really writing this book and going into the mindset of Lily Bloom and being able to bring that character to life, how much more respect she has for her mother and how proud she is of her mother after writing this book. And the note from the author itself just made me bawl. So that's a quick overview. I know I'm all over the place, but I'm going to get to the real deets. I'm going to get to dive into the book, but I just wanted to give a quick overview, trigger warning about it for those that are wanting to pick up this book. Now, why I picked it up and why I chose to read it myself was because I was on TikTok, and apparently I fell into Book Talk, BOOKTOK. Book Talk. Now, Book Talk is all about book reviews, all that good stuff. But the video I came across was of this girl picking up this book, It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover, and basically filming herself. It was like a sped up version of her reading the book in one sitting. And she was highlighting and tears were rolling down in some stuff and everything. And I'm like, I wonder what this book is about if it keeps on coming up on my feed and people keep praising it and crying to it. And me, I'm not one to cry, as I've mentioned before. I'm not a crier. It takes a lot for me to cry. Knock on wood. So, like I said, I picked up this book just thinking it was a dramatic love story, love triangle type of thing. And this wasn't the first book I read from her. So the first book I actually read from Colleen Hoover, which I may do a future episode on, was Reminders of Him. Now that one I read in 2 days. I bought the book for a couple friends and was like, girls, you need to read this book. Tell me what you think, because I can't get enough. And because of that book, when I came across the TikTok that showed this It Ends With Us book, and it was from the same author, I was like, you know what? Let me pick it up. Let me give it a shot, right? I do like her writing style because it's easy to follow for myself. I don't like reading the summary of books. I don't like reading any reviews or seeing any reviews of books. I just like when they say, here's the book, I recommend it, read it, right? After reading this book, I wish I would have had that little trigger warning so I could get myself mentally prepared, because as a survivor, even though years have passed since I've left my abusive marriage, there are still triggers that happen that take me back. They don't happen as often now, but unfortunately, they do still happen. Even after therapy, I still find myself getting anxiety sometimes. Shout out to the fiance, who's very loving and understanding and supportive through situations that may take me back, or things, reading things like this, because I'm a selfish reader. I'll admit that. I'm a selfish reader. I'm a selfish movie watcher. When I'm watching a movie, reading a book, I put myself in the character's point of view. I put myself as if I'm the character and things are happening to me. So I take in things that I watch. I take in things that I read as if I'm the first person. I'm the main character. I mean, duh, I'm the main character of my life. No, but seriously, that's how I read. That's how I watch movies. And that's probably why it hits me so much. So reading situations similar to what I've been through really does trigger me. Now, the first book, I'm not gonna hold too much to it, because that one honestly does go through a lot of the abuse and the cycles of the abuse. The second book is really healing, really full circle. So I'm gonna break down some quotes that stood out to me from this book, and then move on to the second book, which is the second part of her after she officially left the abusive relationship. Now, this is probably where you want to stop, pause if you haven't finished reading the book, because there's going to be some spoiler alerts on both books. Definitely save the episode if you haven't read the book. Go back to read the book yourself, spark notes it if you want, just to get like a in-depth summary, you know, how we would clip notes, shit like that back in the day in high school, trying to summarize the summary. But if you want to just read that because you don't have time to read a whole ass book, by all means, I don't judge. And then come back and hear my thoughts on it. Now, one thing I do like about the author, Colleen Hoover, is that her first sentence in the book usually is like really captivating. It really like pulls in the reader and like, fuck, I want to keep on reading. So the start of this book is the main character, Lily Bloom, sitting on the edge of a building. So automatically your assumption is she's going to unalive herself, right? But apparently she's just there thinking after attending her father's funeral. Lily Bloom's father was abusive, and she still has a relationship with the mother. Now, she made a vow to herself that that would never happen to her. And at her father's funeral, her mom said, get up there and say something good about your father. And when she got up there, she froze, because she literally, all she could remember are the bad things that her father did, which is understandable if her father was a piece of shit abusing her mother. So as she's, you know, in a vulnerable state, because it's right after her father's funeral, she meets this guy, Riles, who also goes up there, and it seems like he's out there for some fresh air. They end up talking, going into some naked truths, as they call it, and really getting to know each other on a deep level, even though it's the first night they meet. Now, one thing that stuck out with me during the first chapter of them meeting is when, and this, again, I went in this blind, not knowing Ryle was going to be a piece of shit, right? There was a quote that really stuck out to me when Ryle says, I feel like everyone fakes who they really are, when deep down, we're all equal amounts of screwed up. Some of us are just better at hiding it than others. And that's on page 16 in chapter 1. And that one right there, it's just like, I've said that when referring to family, like every family is dysfunctional, just some families show it more than others, you know? And so that I highlighted because it's true. Like, we're all sorts of screwed up. Every one of us, like, we're all perfectly flawed in some sort of way. It's just some show it more than others. And I think that's really a foreshadow of he's going to be the asshole. He goes on in the chapter to say that there's no such thing as bad people. We're all just people who sometimes do bad things. Again, is this foreshadowing that he's a bad person? And that's on page 17 in the same chapter. So he goes on to say, like, yeah, we all have a moral compass. We all decide whether or not we're going to like follow it when we're making decisions. We all have that good angel, the bad angel when we're on a fork in the road trying to make a good choice or a bad choice, right? So it ends up saying like, okay, well, I'm still a good person. I just made a bad decision. And as a parent, I do say that to my child because I don't ever want them to think growing up that they're a bad person or a bad kid. And I end up telling them, you're a good kid. You just made a bad decision, because they're kids. I don't want to mold them into thinking they're already a bad person and it following through and becoming that bad person. But him as a whole, as adult, saying that, it's like, okay, are you setting up excuses or what the fuck? It's funny because little things that come up during the book, if you reread it, you're like, oh shit, that is foreshadowing that he's a piece of shit, abusive manipulator, narcissist. The names could go on and on. But since this book is viewed from Lily Bloom's eyes, obviously she brings out and explains the goodness of his, right? Like one of the first times I think they had sex, like he bites into her and hurts her where she explains she feels like she's gonna faint type of thing. And he just admits like, oh my God, you were right. You're like a drug. I'm becoming so addictive to you. I'm so sorry. I just got carried away. And it makes her feel like she's wanted. It makes her feel like this man really loves her, regardless if he says it or not. It makes her feel like, oh shit, I'm desirable to someone, which is something all of us can admit to wanting in life. We want that desire from someone else towards us, right? We want to be desired. We want to be wanted. It's human nature of us to want a partner that is hungry for our love. So again, since it's from her point of view, it definitely brings into point like how she fell in love with this man before the outrage, before the really serious, severe physical abuse began. And it's very similar to how it is in real life. I explained in my own story how I had never seen him go off on a quote unquote tantrum that I call him. I had seen him with other people. I had seen him in relationships. He was a friend. Like I had never seen him as someone abusive. And there were parts of him that I fell in love with. And so when I did sign the divorce, obviously those parts that I had fallen in love with, there was a grieving process because yeah, it's safe to say that once upon a time ago, I was in love. Now, in between the chapters, she goes back to her childhood, her teenage years. Like, I think she explained she was a freshman in high school type of thing, where she meets this other teen boy named Atlas. When they're teens, she notices that Atlas gets off and on at the same bus stop as she does to go to school. Atlas is this really smelly kid that sits in the bus. Nobody wants to talk to him. Everybody had talked shit about him, saying he's homeless, blah, blah, blah. This kid's had a rough life, right? She befriends him knowing that he's living in the abandoned house that is adjacent to hers from the backyard or something like that. So like her bedroom window, she could see the house and he's in there. So she befriends the kid, Atlas, who's homeless and still trying to go to school, and ends up bringing him into the house when her parents are gone to let him shower, give him fresh clothes of her dad's. They cook together, they bake cookies together. This book goes back and forth from her in present day meeting Ryle and falling in love with Ryle to her reading letters that she used to write in her diaries about Atlas, who was her teenage crush. Now, her and Ryle get serious. She meets his sister. She meets his sister's husband. So, they have this thing where they wear onesies to a bar to get free drinks type of thing. And so she likes this whole, this little circle she's made with Ryle. And I should note, he's fucking rich. He lives in a fucking badass building, right? On the top floor. So does his sister. He's a surgeon. So, I mean, come on, who wouldn't want no McDreamy, right? So the book progresses and it shows how she's falling in love with this guy. And it does give little hints here and there that he isn't all that he seems. But she often catches herself thinking it's the resentment she has for her father and she's taking it out on him. And that guilt of having that resentment can definitely blind someone from seeing red flags in a future partner. My parents are happily married. I didn't grow up in an abusive household. So for me to find myself get caught up in something like that was definitely out of left field, At the same time afterwards, I was scared to meet future partners and date because I was afraid of myself in trusting the wrong people and trusting the wrong partner, especially because I had two boys at that time, right? And then when I found someone who was good, like the fiance, I did find some self-sabotaging things where I would tend to push them away because I often compared them to my ex in ways that I shouldn't. So in Lily's case, she was finding herself forgive Ryle for things that he'd do because she thought it was her resentment towards her father that made her try to like blame him for things, right? And one of the physical altercations that happened is he was cooking, they're in the kitchen, they're moved in together already, and he ends up like saying, oh shit, the casserole, I forgot, right? So he rushes to try to get the casserole out before it burns. And she's with him in the kitchen and tries to tell him like, hey, it's gonna be hot, don't forget the oven mitts or whatever. But before she could do that, he's already grabbing onto the glass casserole, which my dumb ass has done before because I see glass and I don't think of glass as hot. But if I use metal pans, then I think, oh shit, it could be hot. So I'm the dumbass that's done that before. Anyways, back to the book. So he pulls it out with his bare hands and he drops it on the floor because he burns his hand. Lily sees him and starts cracking up. To be honest, I'd probably laugh too before I see if they're okay. I mean, I laugh at my fucking self. And I guess from embarrassment, and anger tied together, he ends up hitting her. And she's so shocked by it because she, like, it's one of them good, like, putazos, right? On page 186, she then says, 15 seconds. That's all it takes to completely change everything about a person. 15 seconds that we'll never get back. It only took 15 seconds for him to turn around and fucking hit her. He hit her in her eye in the matter of seconds and she breaks down. He ends up apologizing to her later on. After the scene changes and he's trying to like cuddle with her, kiss her, hug her in bed, she ends up talking about those 15 seconds again, saying for 15 seconds, I saw a side of him that wasn't him. That wasn't me. I laughed at him when I should have been concerned. He shoved me when he should have never touched me. I pushed him away and caused him to cut his hand because she ended up pushing him away after the whole him hitting her in the eye. And he ends up cutting his hand and complains that how, because he's a surgeon, how he has surgery on Monday. And so obviously she feels guilty. That's not the only instance that she ends up coming across with him abusing her. Later in the book, when she gets pushed down some stairs from him, and she tries to blame it like it didn't happen. And then they have to meet up with his family and he says some random ass story to cover his ass. And it's just like seeing those excuses and stuff that in the book, it just puts it into perspective like, fuck, I was Lily Bloom once. Like I blamed myself, forgave several times, took him back and was stuck in a cycle for a couple years. I'm blessed to be a lucky one that was able to leave alive with both my boys. So in between her Lily being stuck in the cycle, Atlas, the childhood teen that she had once fell in love with from carrying him and him being so kind to her and stuff like that, he bumps into her at a fancy restaurant where Ryle had took her and her mom out to eat. So she bumps into Atlas there and like the spark that she once had for him comes back again and she's like, I can't. I'm in love with Ryle. You know, homegirl is loyal, not to the right person at the time, but still, gotta commend her for her loyalty. And it's as if Atlas already knew something was up. So he gives her his number and says, keep it for when you need it. Because I think he saw like a bruise or something, like he noticed something on her that wasn't right and figured it was the guy. And they get into an altercation at the restaurant. Come to find out, homeboy Atlas owns that fucking restaurant. He's the owner of that restaurant. He's a very successful chef in the city. So Lily Bloom doesn't use his number at all, ends up slipping it into the back of her case phone and forgets about it. Fast forward after a couple cycles of her forgiving Ryle, she gets pregnant. So obviously she wants to make it work. She wants to make it work for her baby. And that's the truth. A lot of us want to do whatever it takes to make sure our kids have a well-rounded family, to make sure they don't grow up in a broken family, but it doesn't stop there. You know, like the abuse doesn't stop. Like he's still an asshole. He's still a narcissist. And she's like, needs to stop making excuses because he ends up finding shit. Like he finds the phone number and assumes that she's having sex with this other guy and blah, blah, blah. And like, it's a whole mess, right? By the end of this book, she does make a decision to leave Ryle. And like the ending of this book was like a chef's kiss, honestly. I would have been happy with it just being a one book, that's it, never to be continued type of thing, because of how well written the cycle of an abusive relationship was in this book and the ending of it itself. Like my heart, like I literally cried, and I don't really cry with books, cried when I was finishing this book because it does say cycles exist because they are excruciating to break. It takes us It takes an astronomical amount of pain and courage to disrupt a familiar pattern. Sometimes it seems easier to just keep running in the same familiar circles rather than facing the fear of jumping and possibly not landing on your feet. That paragraph right there is a perfect description of why cycles exist. It's a perfect description of why we find ourselves just continuously forgiving and finding them still disrespecting us, hitting us, abusing us. She goes on to say, my mother went through it. I went through it. I'll be damned if I allow my daughter to go through it. I kiss her on her forehead and make her promise. It stops here with me and you. It ends with us. And with that, she broke that cycle of abuse that her mother endured, that she endured. She had a daughter with the abusive guy. She handed off divorce papers to him and says, you know what? Sorry, I'm not going to try to make it work for our child, because she did contemplate that while during the pregnancy, which I don't blame her. But I'm glad that the ending showed that she wanted to just cut ties with him and be gone and be done. So that summarizes book one. I know it was a lot, but it was just so, I had to get through those quotes. Now, book two is one that came in very healing. And although I would have been good without the second book, I'm so glad she wrote the second book. Apparently, a lot of people wanted to know what happened to Lily Bloom after she filed for divorce after the baby, if she ended up with Atlas, because in there, it just shows that she crossed paths with Atlas when the baby was one. And I think they exchanged numbers or something, or he asked like what the baby's name was. And it ends like that. It ends with just them her and Atlas crossing paths, right? So I guess everybody wanted to know, like, do they end up together? Like, tell us type of thing, right? Me, I would have literally been happy, like, in my head, making it my own ending. Like, they ended up living together, having another couple kids, living life and blah, 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 happily ever after, blah, blah, blah. Little did I know I needed book two, which is It Starts With Us, as much as I needed the first book to read. The second book honestly goes through the aftermath of leaving an abusive relationship, especially when you have kids with them. Now, fortunately, my baby daddy did not fight for custody. He did not try to come visit the kids, did not try to continue to have the connection with the kids. So for me, I have no baby daddy drama. I don't see him for drop-offs, pickups, stuff like that. The abusive ex I'm referring to. Now, the second book I borrowed from my friend, shout out to Jen, because she was like, girl, you need to read it. And she read it in like one sitting and she let me borrow it. And I ended up taking it on vacation with me, reading it here and there. And because the beautiful chaos I live around, it took me more than one sitting to read it, to the point where she was texting me like, girl, did you finish? Not yet. But I was making note of quotes and what pages they were on that really stuck out to me. So the second book shows her having closure after the relationship, because she still finds herself having PTSD, getting anxious at the thought of Ryle finding out that she's dating Atlas, getting anxious at the thought of Ryle finding out she's dating anybody, because Ryle tries in the second book to show her he's changed, to show her like they're meant to be together as a family. And what I love the most about the book is that Ryle's sister and brother-in-law, who you would think would take his side, literally are on Lily's side of the whole situation, because they see what an asshole he could be, Ryle could be, and what temper he has, right? And when it takes a village, I'm telling you, it takes a village. And Lily Bloom's village in this series, she had her mom, she had Atlas, she had Alyssa, which is Ryle's sister's name, and her husband. And I'm telling you, like, that was her village that allowed her to be able to stay out of the cycle she broke out of. Because I'm telling you, it gets hard to the point where on average, it takes about 7 attempts of someone trying to leave someone in order to completely leave them, because they find themselves just coming back into the cycle, because they're just so accustomed to it. They're so used to it. They're so afraid of the unknown that they find themselves just coming back. So because she had that village of people supporting her in her decision not to be in a family with Ryle, and it become an abusive setting for the child, I think it really aimed at her success in being able to stay away from him. Now, at the start, there was already a quote I had to write down on page 7 of It Starts With Us, which is, I have to remind myself that not every apology is attached to something as awful as the things that were attached to apologies I used to receive. That itself, it's so true, because those that have came out of abusive relationships, they find the sorries as something that reminds them of the worst possible things that could have been happened. Like sorries that I've received weren't as genuine and were for some heavy ass shit that happened to me in that abusive marriage. While sorries to someone else could be so genuine as someone bumping into you and saying, oh, my bad, I'm sorry. And you taking it like, okay. But for someone who's been in the abusive relationship, they hear sorry and it's like, do you mean it? Or are you trying to get something from me and, manipulate me type of thing? Because that's just what we had been used to. So that quote spoke volumes to me because I felt that quote deep. Let me tell you. The next one, which I guess I didn't write what page it was on, it was Lily Bloom saying, I was more naive back then. I didn't know how rare men like Atlas were, so I didn't know how lucky I was to have him in my life. Now, I found my Atlas, let me tell you. The fiance, he's my Atlas. Yes, I've dated guys after the abusive marriage before my fiance, but they never, honestly, they could never compare to the softness and patience that the fiance has with me. The support he has with me, the way he loves my kids. Like in this book, Atlas loves Emerson, which is Lily Bloom's daughter's name. He loves Emerson as if that was his kin, like that was his own. And one of the moments I did see the fiance as being it was the way he was with my boys when I finally brought him around, because let me tell you that did take some time for me to bring him around. And in the book, same thing. She had the exact same thing where she debated when it would be a good time for him to come around her kid because she didn't want to cross that boundary. She wanted to respect Ryle as a father and stuff like that. Me, I didn't have no baby daddy to think about, but still I didn't want to bring just any rando around the kids. So that really made me think like, should I, But when I finally did bring him around, like, oh my goodness, even to this day, their relationship is just like, not gonna lie, earlier today, my oldest asked to bake a cake and I was working. And I was like, bro, I can't. I mean, yeah, sometimes I call him bro, even though he's my kid. But I told him I can't. And I said, I told him that if my fiance wanted to watch him and supervise him, then by all means. So he asked him, and I go out and they're baking a freaking cake together. And it was the cutest thing ever to see. But sometimes they get their moments where they freaking wrestle like that. The guy and the stepdad in Hot Rod, So just seeing their relationship blossom, it just made me fall in love with my fiance even more. Another quote that I took out was on page 110, and it was, there's nothing easy about fearing for your safety anytime you make a misstep. And that right there is like true, because I just had a conversation with one of my friends earlier that like where I told her I appreciate her for understanding that sometimes my text backs may be 2 to 3 business days, and it's only because I'm not all like, I try not to always be on my phone all the time and let it consume me. And when I first left my abusive relationship, there was the mishap I was afraid to make. The misstep I was afraid to make was of letting my phone die and not being able to check in. And it still comes up on my Facebook memory where it says, I let my phone die today. It was the most exhilarating feeling ever, knowing that I didn't need to have the fear I carried for so long because I couldn't check in with someone, letting them know my every move. And that's just one of those things that like we don't think about, like that type of freedom we have that we don't think about until we've been through something traumatic or an abusive relationship where like letting our phone die and not having it on us all the time to answer as quickly. It's like a freedom that we have that we take for granted because we don't know what it's like not to be able to let our phone die with no repercussions, So living in fear is something I'm very familiar with, which that book details. In the second book, she does really put in emphasis how hard it is to stay out of the cycle once you break it. And I commend her for the words she uses because honestly, I wrote down this quote and I'm not sure what page it's on, but this quote is from the book It Starts With Us, and the words Colleen Hoover puts together. I've probably reread this over and over because it's so true. It is so true. And I'm probably going to get emotional reading it, but here it goes. How do people leave these cycles when they don't have the resources I had or the support from their friends and family? How do they possibly stay strong enough every second of the day? I feel like all it takes is one weak, insecure moment in the presence of your ex to convince yourself you made the wrong decision. Anyone who has ever left a manipulative, abusive spouse and somehow stayed that course deserves a medal, a statue, a freaking superhero movie. Society has obviously been worshiping the wrong heroes this whole time because I'm convinced it takes less strength to pick up a building than it does to permanently leave an abusive situation.
End quote.
That is so fucking true. It takes so much work to stay out of the relationship once you've broken the cycle. I'm going back to that Netflix series Made. And in that series, Homegirl goes back to the abusive cycle she's used to. And I've said it in my episode 2, I Am Resilient, that if it wasn't for my family that like allowed me to stay, like took me in, from my cousin that took me in and out of the household while he was arrested, to me coming to Texas and being with my family. If it wasn't for my family, like giving me the support of leaving him, telling me I made the right decision, who knows where I would have been? Who knows if I would have had this like this badass Roxx with Me podcast? I probably wouldn't. I'd probably be stuck in my little shell, being more introvert than I am now and not being myself, because when I was in the abusive relationship, I literally was not myself. I was not myself. And I just had my bachelorette weekend getaway, and me and one of my high school friends were just talking, and she knew me before the abusive marriage. She knew me during and after. And she says she knew there was something wrong because I was not myself. Like I was there, but I wasn't there. That when I was around him, I wouldn't look at anybody. I wouldn't talk to anybody. And it's funny because I don't remember purposely doing that. I guess at that point it was second nature, the way he had me quote unquote trained, quote unquote brainwashed, whatever you want to call it. Now look at me doing my thing. I already have a successful podcast, Good Vibes and Thick Thighs. And now I'm doing this and speaking into existence. It's going to be another successful podcast, Roxx with Me, with my supportive fiance and the boys. So I had my village of people that helped me. So her writing that and showing, expressing into words how hard it is to stay out of an abusive cycle. Like, I applaud Colleen Hoover for putting that into a book for people to read. Just because it became a TikTok trend and people are picking up this book, I hope they really pause and reflect on how hard it can be to break that cycle. Oh my gosh, who am I? Just kidding. I get very passionate when it comes to talking against domestic violence. I get super passionate about it. I bet those that don't know me are going to be like, this Yorana, she's always talking about how she doesn't cry. Another breakthrough that Lily Bloom has in the second book, It Starts With Us, is when she realizes the difference of the type of anger your spouse can have. She was so used to Ryle's anger, where he would outburst his anger and have temper tantrums and take it out on her in some cases, where she would hit her in the eye, push her down some stairs. What a mess of abuse, right? Then comes Atlas, who she's dating, and she sees the type of anger he expresses, and his anger is more not against her. Like, no matter what gets him angry, he knows how to deal with it in a healthy manner where it does not end up in him putting hands on her or him putting blame on her or turning the anger and feelings towards her, which is something that she's not clearly used to because Lily Bloom's character grew up in an abusive household, was in an abusive marriage, and now in this healthy relationship. It's very eye-opening for her to see, like, oh, is this how it's supposed to be? And that's something that I've caught myself doing too. Like when I go out with my friends and he says, you don't have to check in. Like, I trust you. You're having a good time. Like, I'll be home waiting for you. You don't have to consistently tell me your every move. And it's just like, is that not what we do? Like, is that not the norm? You know, trying to still break chains off of what's left over from surviving an abusive marriage. So on page 182, she sees Atlas kind of have this feeling of anger, right? And she has this epiphany. So I'm going to read a quote when she realizes. She puts, I realize the significance of this moment. I'm alone with an angry man in my apartment, but I'm not in fear for my life because he isn't angry at me. He's angry at a person who hurt me. It's a protective anger. And there's a world of difference between my reactions to Ryle's anger versus my reaction to Atlas's anger.
End quote.
And that speaks volumes in itself. Because it is like you get so accustomed from the abuse that you don't realize what's normal, because your normal is the abuse that you've gone through. And it's something that I recommend people to talk it out with someone, because I've had my days where I'm like, okay, so what's a healthy disagreement? Do all disagreements lead to abuse? Do all disagreements eventually lead to someone getting hurt physically? And it's not like that. You could have a healthy disagreement amongst couples without turning it into an abusive or emotionally abusive relationship. And that's something I had to work through. Now, during the second book, it starts with us. Atlas is going through his own shit. I know I talked about a lot about Lily Bloom leaving the abusive relationship and her tiptoeing around Ryle, making sure she doesn't like do a misstep or anything like that, and how Ryle's still trying to convince her to come like be a family with him and stuff. But during this book, Atlas still has his own shit going on, which keeps up with the dramatics of the novel itself. Like it gives those that aren't here for the healing portion of Lily Bloom something to be entertained with, because Atlas has his own mommy issues that he deals with in the second book. He finds out he has a little brother. He takes him in like his own. And that's something that Lily has to also deal with, having like, okay, if I'm gonna be in this relationship, it's him and his brother, just like Atlas on the other side. If he's going to be in the relationship with Lily, it's her and her kid, plus the drama of the baby daddy, right? So it is kind of a lot of the dramatics, but it does keep the reader captivated in the sense where they continue to read to see how everything plays out, if it's really truly going to be a happy ending. Now, as I mentioned, Lily Bloom's character grew up in a childhood where abuse was present. Her dad abusing her mom, right? And she takes note of the progress her mother's made by mentioning this, and I quote, "My mother has always been a little hard to get to open up. I can't blame her. She spent years with a man who left her no voice, so I'm sure it's been hard for her to learn how to use it again." And I think every survivor has had that moment where they've seen themselves not voice out what their needs, not voice out their concerns, not have a voice, period, because of how diminished their flame was when they were in the abusive relationship. Part of the healing process is definitely finding your voice again. I found mine. Here's the second podcast I'm producing and hosting, and this time on my own. And nobody's going to shut me up now. And I take pride in the voice I found. I was broken, found all the pieces, put them back together like a puzzle, probably put them together differently, but they still made the same heart. And I'm just a brand new person. It's a brand new me. So it's something that I'm not going to be silenced in. Now, considering this was my first book review ever, and I covered 2 books, I hope I still kept you entertained through it. And I hope I encourage you to read it. And I want to hear your thoughts on it. Hit me up on Instagram, Roxx with Me Podcast, or send me an email, roxxwithme@gmail.com. And let me know if you've read the series It Ends With Us and It Starts With Us books, and what your personal thoughts and takes were. Did you expect it to be the story it was of surviving an abusive relationship, healing through the abusive relationship, aside from the side drama from like Atlas, her mom, and Ryle and stuff like that? Like, I'm talking about Lily Bloom's story in the majority of this episode. So I want to hear your thoughts on what you thought. Do you agree with the public's view on the opinion that this book romanticizes domestic violence? Because I, for one, I explained it at the beginning, I do not think so, just because Lily Bloom gets back into the cycle over and over again and falls in love with Ryle over and over again does not necessarily romanticize the abuse. It literally is exposing what it truly is to be an abusive relationship, that cycle, and how hard it is to break. But I want to hear your thoughts. You've heard some of my favorite quotes from both books. If you've read the books and have a quote that sticks out that you want, that you want to share with me, definitely share with me. Now, I want to end my book reviews with my dream movie cast. Now, I know there's already a movie in the works for this book, and it contained Lily Bloom being played by Blake Lively, which, cool. But, when I was reading the book, it was prior to when they released the cast of the characters. So in my head, I had this cast already brewing, right? right? And give me your thoughts. Here's my It Ends With Us / It Starts With Us movie cast. For Lily Bloom, I'd pick Miss Emma Stone, who people know her from Easy A. They also know her from Crazy Stupid Love, and quite recently from Cruella. Now, I chose Emma Stone because from her character she's played, she's always had that like sense of like, I don't know about in Cruella, but like that sense of like, I don't want to call it goofiness, but like, I don't know, like this dorky swag to her, you know? So I feel like that would be Miss Lily Bloom. For Atlas, who is homeless teen that Lily Bloom falls in love with as a teenager and later crosses path and ends up with, who is such a sweetheart, honestly, I chose Jake T. Austin, who came out in Wizards of Waverly Place, also came out in The Fosters. I think he'd be a good Atlas because he has that, like, I don't know, like that country sweet homeboy type of face. Now, for Ryle, my ideal person to play Ryle in a movie would be Ryan Guzman. Ryan Guzman comes out in the movie The Boy Next Door, which is literally like a flip of the switch. He goes from the nice boy next door to like this like crazy lunatic stalkerish boy, right? And that movie is like what I pictured him when I was reading this book, because he goes from like a sweet boy to like crazy in zero point 0.5 seconds type of thing, right? He also comes out in the show 911 that comes out on Fox as this firefighter that like, you know, like Captain Save-A-Ho, right? So I feel like he'd be good for that, for the Ryle character who tends to Lily in that cycle. Here I am, a good kid, then flips the switch. Now, for Ryle's sister, Alyssa, I would have Miss Becky G play her, because Alyssa is like in the book. I know I didn't explain her so much in this like summary and book review, but in the book, she's Lily's like best friend. She works for Lily, even though she's rich. She just works for Lily on the side just because she wants something to do. She's one of the people that tells Lily, like, no, my brother's an asshole. You did the right move type of thing, and supports Lily's decision. Becky G came out in the remake of the Power Rangers. I want to say she was she was the Yellow Ranger. She was a Yellow Ranger in the Power Rangers movie. And I don't know, she's so bubbly that I feel like she'd be a perfect Alyssa in the movie. Now, Alyssa's husband, Marshall, who's like that guy that dresses up in onesies with Ryle and like hangs out, typical college dude type and stuff like that, who's married to Alyssa. For him, I would choose Josh Hutcherson, who came out in The Hunger Games. I feel he'd have the charisma to play Marshall, because in a scene in the book, It Starts With Us, there's a part where he sits in the hallway with Lily after a blowout and tells her, like, he's not really good at giving advice, but he could tell her one thing, that like Ryle's an asshole and he could see it, and he doesn't judge her for the decisions she makes. And it becomes from like this like really awkward moment, you could tell, to like this really wholesome moment where he's more like a big brother type of person to Lily. And that's why I would choose Josh Hutcherson. So that would be my dream cast. Too bad they already made their decision, but I respect it. Now, to end this episode, I do want to do a song recommendation, because I've been building up my playlist. Roxx just made the playlist on Spotify. It already has songs from the past. I also posted on IG whatever song I add to the playlist. And going into the theme of that quote that really stood out about how people that stay out of abusive marriages are freaking superheroes that deserve medals and statues in superhero movies, I want to put out the song for you all to listen to, Superwoman by Alicia Keys, because we are all superwomen. Well, thank you for rocking with me. I know this was a little bit longer, but I promise I'll be more structured in the next book review, and I hope you enjoy this one. Until next time, have a blessed week.